They whispered her name in the corridors of power, but never out loud, not because it was forbidden, but because it was dangerous. Theodora, not born into silk, but into sweat, not from palace, but from stage, not veiled in honor, but wrapped in rumor. Before she was empress, before she shaped an empire with nothing but her gaze and her rage, she was flesh to be bought, a spectacle to be consumed, a girl in a world where women were not meant to survive, much less rule. They called her a prostitute, a dancer, a seductress. They said she slept with hundreds of men, some said 600, others said more. But behind every number was something more terrifying than lust. There was choice and power. The kind of power that terrified the men who paid her because she was not broken by it. She was watching them, counting, learning, building something they could not see, not a future of obedience, but one of domination. She did not hate men. She simply knew what they were. She knew the way they looked through women instead of at them. She knew how their promises melted when the lights dimmed. And so, while they came for her body, she carved her mind into something sharper than any sword they carried. Theodora was born at the bottom of the Byzantine world, not as a citizen, but as an object. Her father died. Her mother pleaded for mercy. The family descended into the alleys of Constantinople, where the dirt clings to your skin even after you wash it. By the time she was a teenager, she was performing obscene pantomimes in the hippodrome, not for pleasure, but for survival. But some women rot in shame. Others rise in it. She turned her body into a weapon, not through seduction, but through spectacle. When men watched her, they felt power. But what they missed was that she was stealing it. Every glance, every coin, every breath offered in her presence was taken like a brick for the empire she was building in her mind. She learned the way crowds moved, the way rumors traveled, the way men unraveled when their pride was kissed by fire. And then she vanished. No one knows exactly when or why. She left the stage, left the city, traveled across the Mediterranean through cities and courts, a shadow in silk. She observed kings and monks, traitors and tyrants. She slept when she needed to, begged when she had to, and always, always listened. It was not repentance, it was evolution. And when she returned to Constantinople, she was no longer a performer. She was a storm. She met Justinian not as a supplicant, but as a mirror. He was a rising politician, brilliant, ruthless, precise. But what he lacked was flame, and Theodora was flame incarnate. She did not flatter him. She did not seduce him. She reflected him. She saw in him the same hunger she had carved into herself, not for power, but for permanence. He made her his wife. The empire howled. The Senate sneered. The clergy wept. A prostitute in the palace? A harlot on the throne? But Justinian saw what they did not. Theodora was not his weakness. She was his weapon. And soon she would be something more. An empress. But the past has teeth. And Theodora knew that once you rise, the world does not forgive your origin. So she rewrote it. She erased the scrolls, burned the records, silenced the mouths. Every whisper of her former life was met with a new reality. A crown, a decree, a sentence. The woman who had once been bought now named the price. They said she slept with 600 men. Perhaps she did, but what no one speaks of is how many feared her once she stood above them. In her rise was not shame, but prophecy. She did not try to cleanse her past. She weaponized it. She knew that purity is a myth used to silence women, so she made impurity divine. She stood in the Hagia Sophia not as a penitent, but as a queen in gold, beside a man who ruled the world, and in many ways ruled him. Theodora did not ask to be remembered. She demanded it. And yet, the memory of her still bleeds contradiction. Some call her a saint, others a monster. But the truth, as always, lies in the shadows between them. She was not virtuous, she was victorious. And sometimes, history only remembers the ones who dared to survive it. Theodora didn't rule from behind the curtain. She didn't whisper into her husband's ear like some fragile counsel dressed in silk. She ruled from beside him, eyes forward, spine straight, crown high. And the empire noticed. The court noticed. The church noticed. All of Constantinople watched her, not like a queen, but like a crack in the sky. A sign. A threat. A scandal wrapped in authority. She never apologized. Not for who she had been. Not for what she had done to get there. She walked the palace halls like she owned them, because in her mind she did, and that terrified the men around her. not because she was cruel, but because she knew. She knew what they said behind closed doors. She knew how they joked about her past, how they measured her against some imaginary ideal of a virtuous empress. But Theodora didn't aspire to be virtuous. She aspired to be eternal. The city muttered stories of the woman who once lay with hundreds. But in the Senate chambers it was her voice that shaped law. In the basilicas it was her policy that shaped morality. She stood before patriarchs and generals and reminded them, with just a glance, that her power did not require their permission. It never had. She was not merciful, not always. She didn't need to be. Mercy, in a city built on treason, was a weakness. Constantinople was a viper's nest. Gold on the surface, rot beneath. Factions carved the streets with violence, the blues, the greens, riots that shook the city like earthquakes. And while Justinian tried to pacify them with politics, Theodora understood something deeper. Blood speaks louder than words. It was in those days that she earned her place not just in history, but in fear. The Nika riots were not a protest. They were an explosion. A mob of tens of thousands set the city ablaze, looting, burning, screaming Justinian's name with hatred. Senators plotted his removal, generals faltered, advisors begged him to flee. He almost did, but Theodora didn't. In the middle of the palace, as men panicked around her, she rose, not like a queen, but like a storm summoned into flesh. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. The room went silent, and then she said it. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. I will not flee. Purple makes a fine burial shroud. In those words was the truth of her life. She had crawled through filth, endured shame, been touched and tossed, and discarded like something without a soul. She had been everything the Empire despised. And now she would not run. Not from fire, not from men, not from death. Justinian stayed. He crushed the rebellion with brutal force. 30,000 died in the Hippodrome that week. Blood soaked the marble. But the throne remained. And so did she. After that, they stopped questioning her. But victory has a strange cost. Theodora did not soften. She hardened. She moved through the palace like someone always being hunted, because she was. Not by assassins or rivals, but by her own past. She had buried it in ash and silence, but it lived in every glance, every half-smile from some noble wife, every sermon whispered too loudly. So she built her own empire, one not of conquest, but of protection. She created laws for women, banning forced prostitution, granting rights to actresses, sheltering former courtesans. She created sanctuaries in her own name, not because she believed in redemption, but because she believed in defiance. Every reform she passed was a knife into the memory of the world that once fed on her body. Every law she wrote was a stone in the tomb of who she had once been. But she never forgot that woman. At night in the quiet, Theodora was not gold and purple. She was still silk and blood. Still the girl who had stood on a stage and watched men throw coins at her like she was something less than human. Still the woman who had wandered through cities alone, knowing that no one would care if she vanished into a gutter. Power didn't erase that. It sharpened it. And that's what made her dangerous. Because she understood what it meant to be powerless. And she knew that her rule would only last as long as she could keep the story under control. The narrative, the image, the myth. She understood that empires aren't made of stone. They're made of memory. So she controlled it. She ordered records destroyed, scrolls rewritten, witnesses silenced. Even old friends, if they knew too much, were exiled or erased. She became the curator of her own legend, the guardian of a story that could not be allowed to slip into vulgarity. It wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Because Theodora knew, if they ever remembered her as she truly was, they would never believe she could have been what she became. And so she burned the evidence. Not the men. The men didn't matter, they were already dust. It was their knowledge of her that had to die. Their memories, their words, their smirks. She erased them one by one, until even their ghosts forgot her face. This wasn't erasure, it was authorship. She wasn't hiding the truth. She was rewriting it. And that perhaps is what makes Theodora so haunting. Not that she was a sinner turned saint or a courtesan crowned queen, but that she was both, and refused to let anyone reduce her to either. She did not beg to be remembered. She dared to be remembered on her own terms. Theodora stood in the center of the world, not as a symbol of piety, not as a vessel of divine grace, but as the most dangerous thing a woman could be, unrepentant. She wore the cross, yes, but not as submission. She clutched it like a blade, and the church, which had raised emperors and broken kings, found itself staring at a woman it could neither sanctify nor silence. She didn't kneel to bishops, she studied them. She understood what they worshipped was not heaven, but influence. So she spoke their language, but she translated it. And what emerged was a kind of spiritual war, waged not with swords or scrolls, but with a smile that refused to bend. She embraced monophysitism, a doctrine condemned by Constantinople's religious elite, and turned it into a weapon of the disenfranchised. While Justinian, ever the legalist, tried to unify doctrine for the empire's political survival, Theodora saw something different in these heresies. A map of the wounded, a tool to pull power away from those who assumed they owned salvation. And so she began to build churches, secretly, quietly, then boldly, not for Rome, not for glory, but for defiance, for the whisper of those who had been told they were wrong, broken, or damned. She didn't preach. She provided. She sent priests into exile with coin tucked into their hands. She offered sanctuary to dissidents the empire had sworn to silence. Her palace was not just a court. It was a network of secrets, and she stood at the center like a spider in gold. Men called it rebellion. She called it reparation. Theodora wasn't interested in holiness. She was interested in control, and she understood that the divine, like the erotic, was simply another form of power misunderstood by those who claimed to own it. She knew how both were used to chain women, and so she stole them back. The same body that had once been sold became the body that commanded the attention of theologians, generals, and foreign kings. When she walked through the basilicas, the incense clung to her not like smoke, but like memory. A girl once paid for the way she danced now stood among mosaics immortalized in gold and glass, not as a sinner, not as a queen, as both. And this terrified the men who had never had to reconcile their own contradictions, because they knew, for all their robes and rituals, they had never walked through fire the way she had. They had never used their own humiliation as scaffolding. They had never bled for power. They had inherited it. But Theodora had forged hers, and it made them afraid. So they whispered, wrote, painted her in veils of rumor, said she corrupted Justinian, said she ruled him through lust, that her influence was unnatural, unholy, unearned. They could not believe that a man so brilliant could be ruled by a woman once wrapped in grease paint and shame, and so they insisted. She must have bewitched him. But there was no spell, only clarity, because Justinian, for all his ambition, had one blind spot, humanity. He saw the empire in marble, law, and decree, but Theodora saw it in wounds, in secrets, in what people wouldn't say out loud, and that made her irreplaceable. They were not in love in the way stories want us to believe. Not always, not tenderly. They fought. She refused. He retreated. They negotiated not like lovers, but like emperors. And that was the truest form of intimacy they ever knew. Still, there were nights, deep, quiet nights, when Theodora would lie beside him, eyes open to the dark, and wonder what it would take to stop being a myth, what it would feel like to just be a woman again. Not a weapon, not a memory. But sleep never answered her, because the higher she rose, the more distant she became from the world that had birthed her. She couldn't go back to the hippodrome, not even in disguise. She couldn't walk the market streets of Constantinople smelling fish and dust and figs. She couldn't laugh without someone reading meaning into it. Every movement now echoed through rumor. Every choice was prophecy. Every silence, a threat. So she learned to live behind glass. But glass can crack. One day a letter arrived, not from a priest, not from a noble, from a woman she had once known, long before the crown. A name she hadn't heard in decades. Someone who had shared the same stage, the same dressing room, the same silence after the last man left. The letter was simple. A plea. She was sick, alone, forgotten, and she asked nothing, only to be remembered. Theodora didn't answer. Not with words. She had the woman found, cared for, brought to a sanctuary under another name, fed, clothed, hidden. But she didn't see her, because Theodora knew that to see her would tear open the wall she had built, would remind her of the girl she had buried, and she could not afford to mourn the version of herself she had burned away. Power is made of sacrifices, and Theodora had made more than most. She had sacrificed her name, her truth, her softness. She had turned her past into a secret so heavy it threatened to crush her, and yet she carried it, not because she wanted to, but because no one else ever would. She had become the kind of woman the world doesn't know what to do with. Too strong to pity, too complex to worship, too real to erase. And in that space, between admiration and accusation, she built her legacy. One decree at a time. One scandal at a time. One silence at a time. She was no longer dancing. She was orchestrating. History remembers her in mosaic. Eyes wide, hands still, cloaked in emerald and gold, frozen in divine perfection. But that image is a lie. Theodora did not stand still. She moved, like smoke, like fire, like something between human and symbol. And those who tried to pin her down with icons and scripture forgot the one truth that made her dangerous. She was alive. Not alive in the ordinary sense. Not merely breathing or ruling. Alive in a way that made men tremble. Alive in the choices she made, in the silences she weaponized, in the way her presence interrupted the order of things. She was the disruption carved into the rhythm of empire. But disruption demands sacrifice, and the more she ruled, the more she lost. Theodora's palace was vast, but her world was small. She could not befriend, she could not confide, she could not be seen crying or laughing too loudly or doubting or failing. She was no longer allowed the luxury of being human, because the moment she showed vulnerability, the vultures would smell it, and they were always circling. She understood this, accepted it, but it did not make the loneliness easier. There were days when she would wander the upper levels of the palace, alone, ignoring the guards, brushing her fingers against the marble as if it could speak. There were nights when she would sit at the edge of the bed while Justinian slept and watching him breathe, wondering if even he truly saw her anymore. He loved her. That was certain. But even love bends beneath the weight of empire. He had become a god in law, and she had become an idea in flesh. And ideas do not get to falter. Still, she ruled, not as an ornament, not as an advisor, but as a sovereign in her own right. Her voice was not a suggestion, it was policy. Her opinions were not emotional, they were strategic. She negotiated with foreign emissaries. She intercepted letters meant for the emperor. She redrew maps behind closed doors. And yet the world kept asking, how could she know so much? As if wisdom were a robe one had to inherit. As if power could only belong to those born without wounds. But Theodora's wounds were her knowledge. Every humiliation she had endured, every night she had been bought, every whisper she had overheard in the shadows. These were her teachers. Pain had refined her more than any tutor ever could. Still, the rumors persisted. She was poisoning the emperor's mind. She was ruling through seduction. She was undermining the church, the senate, the generals. They called her the empire's Eve, beautiful, corrupting, necessary to blame. When they could not defeat her authority, they questioned her morality. When they could not defeat her morality, they questioned her sanity. They said she was paranoid, and maybe she was. But when you build your throne atop the ashes of your own erasure, paranoia is not madness. It is survival. There were plots. She knew it. Advisors who smiled too quickly, courtiers who bowed too deeply, officials who lingered outside her chamber thinking she didn't notice. She noticed everything. That was her curse, to be the woman who could never unsee what had been done to her, and what might still be done if she stumbled. So she tightened her circle, replaced men with women, trained spies, rewarded silence, built a palace within the palace, a network of eyes and ears and loyalists who owed their lives to her. To some, this looked like tyranny, but to Theodora it was simply insurance, the cost of continuing. Because the longer she stayed in power, the more history twisted around her. She was no longer Theodora the woman. She had become Theodora the myth. And myths are dangerous things. They belong to no one, yet everyone claims them. They are rewritten, repainted, reimagined, and in every retelling a piece of the truth dies. She could feel herself being hollowed out, even as she walked through the city in procession, and the cheers felt distant. The flowers, the incense, the robes, they no longer touched her. She had become untouchable. And that, she realized, was the most terrifying state of all, because it meant that when she died, the world would fill in the blanks however it pleased. They would call her a whore, a saint, a tyrant, a feminist before her time, a cautionary tale, a martyr of the flesh. They would argue not over her choices, but over what her choices meant. And in that storm of opinion, her voice would vanish. So she began to prepare. Not for death, for legacy. She ordered monuments built not to herself, but to women. She endowed homes for orphans and widows, women who had once been branded like cattle by the same world that once branded her. She funded schools. She empowered midwives. She made sure that when her name was erased, her fingerprints would remain. Still, she could feel time closing in. She was not old, but power consumes quickly. The crown weighed heavier with each passing year, and her body, betrayer of her past, vessel of her myth, began to falter. She did not complain. She did not retreat. She simply began to write letters. To her enemies, to the church, to the people. Not confessions, not pleas, just warnings. That memory like fire spreads. That silence like dust accumulates. That no empire is safe from the judgment of a woman who was once invisible. She sealed them, had them hidden. Some say they were destroyed after her death. Others say they remain, waiting. Somewhere beneath the stones of Constantinople, wrapped in wax and iron, her words sleep. Not for now, for the moment the world is ready to hear them. She died in her 40s, no great spectacle, no grand farewell. Just a curtain drawn in a room too large for grief. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was aftershock. There was no crowd outside the palace that morning. No riots, no mourning wails in the streets. Just the slow movement of servants who had grown used to silence. Theodora had died without warning, and yet everyone seemed to know it before the official word. Some lives end with spectacle. Hers ended with stillness. But stillness is not absence. It's compression. It's what happens when the weight of a life too large for its time finally stops moving, and the world doesn't quite know what to do with the space that remains. Justinian wept, but not as a husband, not even as an emperor. He wept like a man who had just lost the one person who had ever dared to see through him, challenge him, complete him. For years people had whispered that she ruled him, that she was the mind behind the crown, and perhaps she was. But Justinian didn't mind. He had always known she was not his shadow. She was his edge. Without her, his sharpness dulled. In the weeks that followed, the palace tried to rearrange itself. Dresses were packed away. Her private chapel was sealed. The throne room remained intact, but everyone felt it. The absence with a presence. She wasn't there, and yet she was. In the scent of cedar where she once walked, in the sound of distant sandals brushing stone, in the way no one sat quite right on the cushion where she used to speak. Justinian ordered monuments, of course. Mosaics, prayers, a basilica to immortalize her name. But even he knew. She had never needed his tributes. Theodora had already designed her own immortality, not through piety, not through lineage, through impact. She had altered the flow of law. She had changed the way women entered contracts, marriages, sanctuaries. She had made the church flinch. She had made men think before they spoke her name aloud. And perhaps that was her greatest act. Not that she ruled, but that she left behind doubt. A permanent scar in the fabric of certainty. A question mark shaped like a woman. But the empire was not a storybook. It did not pause for reflection. The wheels of power kept grinding. Theodora's allies were reassigned, her reforms challenged. Some were quietly undone. Some were left in place, but renamed. The patriarchy, as always, tried to outlive her. But there was one thing they could not undo. The fear. Not fear of her revenge. Not even fear of her name. Fear that someone like her, someone with nothing, could become what they could not control. That a woman who had once been passed between hands like property could walk back into the world, head high, eyes leveled, and say, "I own myself now." And worse, that she could teach others to do the same. Because Theodora was never meant to be empress. She was never meant to be remembered. She was meant to disappear, to be one of thousands of nameless bodies offered up to appetite and then discarded. But she didn't disappear. She climbed. Not cleanly, not righteously. She clawed, seduced, lied, waited, listened. And when the door finally opened, she walked through it not with gratitude, but with a challenge. Try and stop me. They never did. Even her enemies, those who loathed her, those who burned her image behind closed doors, never dared to face her directly. Because Theodora had transcended womanhood as they understood it. She was no longer wife or whore or queen. She had become a force, not a virtue, not a sin, something older, like thunder, like vengeance, like memory. And so after her death, when the city moved on, or tried, something remained behind, a feeling, an ache. that they had not fully understood what they had lost. It wasn't just power. It was a new shape of power, one that didn't beg, one that didn't wear armor, one that didn't explain itself. And years later, when poets wrote of her, they didn't describe her with accuracy. They described her with awe, as if she had always been too large for the page, too loud for the cathedral, too alive for the script. And maybe that was what she wanted all along, not to be remembered clearly, but to be remembered incompletely, so that her myth would never end, because Theodora knew what most rulers never grasp. A perfect story is a dead one, but a fragmented legend that lives forever, and that is what she became. A legend with no clean edges, a woman with no defined beginning or end, a name that does not invite answers, only questions, a question that still burns centuries later. What happens when a woman takes back her story and refuses to share it? You don't find Theodora in textbooks, not the real her. You find fragments, a mosaic in Ravenna, a line in a chronicle, half sneer, half fear, a passing insult in the pen of Procopius, cloaked in bitter sarcasm and scandalous innuendo. They say she danced naked on marble stages, that she slept with men in public, that she prayed to demons while whispering into the emperor's ear. They said these things not to describe her, but to destroy her. And yet she remains, not in their stories, in ours. Because every version they wrote to shame her only proved her reach. She lived so far outside their understanding that all they could do was mythologize her in the language of menace. But Theodora was never a monster. She was never a miracle. She was a woman who refused to disappear, a woman who made her body a bridge between the condemned and the divine, and dared to walk it in full view of the world. They said she burned the records, that she ordered every piece of parchment mentioning her early life erased. But she knew. No flame could erase what had already become legend. The rumors were her shield. The shame was her sword. And the fire was not concealment. It was curation. Because Theodora understood what the Empire did not. That survival is not the opposite of virtue. Sometimes it's the only virtue. She had survived being reduced to an object. She had survived the gaze that tried to strip her of soul. She had survived being watched, bought, violated, erased. And then she made herself visible again. Not as property, as presence. And the world never recovered. Her name, once whispered in taverns, now echoed in churches. Her decisions, once mocked as feminine meddling, now reshaped the moral foundation of the empire. Her voice, once sold for pleasure, now broke the silence of courts and councils. She became the contradiction that history couldn't untangle. A whore turned holy. A sinner turned sovereign. A spectacle turned sovereign silence. And in the centuries that followed, when men carved out roles for women, wife, nun, virgin, mother, there was always that one figure they couldn't explain. The one who didn't fit. The one who ruled not through purity, but through refusal. They could bury her body. They could rewrite the laws, but they couldn't put out the echo. And now, we live in a world still haunted by her shadow. Every time a woman is told she's too bold, too sexual, too loud, every time a survivor is asked to apologize for her own strength, every time a queen is expected to smile like a girl, Theodora returns, not in fire, in the quiet defiance of endurance. Because she was not a martyr. She was not waiting for history's forgiveness. She did not ask to be saved. She did not die for anyone. She lived for herself, and in doing so, she cracked open a space in time that still refuses to close. A space where power is not gifted, it is claimed. Where legacy is not earned, it is constructed. Where a woman can be everything at once, sacred and profane, broken and indestructible, forgotten and unforgettable. She did not leave behind heirs. She left behind a question. What if shame is not weakness? What if survival is not sin? What if the past, no matter how ugly, can be the foundation of something untouchable? She slept with 600 men, maybe. She burned the evidence, definitely. But the only thing that ever truly mattered was that she wrote the ending herself, and she made damn sure it would never fade.